Okay, so here's what we're going to talk about. Clinical Trial Agreement Review 101. We're going to hit recent OIG Advisory Opinion 22-05, research payments, enrollment incentives, and this notice of non-compliance. And I'm in the office, so I'm just going to ask my the back office staff if they can mute their computers because I can hear myself in the background. So let's go to the next slide. So this is what clinical trial agreements and research may feel like to you sometimes. This is a pretty arcane area of our practice, or food and drug practice, if you will. And it's not just food and drug. You have anti-fraud issues, privacy issues. It checks all the boxes. You also have the potential malpractice issues for the investigators and product liability for the company. So it's very complex. So this image is just to, hopefully it's not this complicated for you, but it may feel like it sometimes. So I'm going to start with a polling question here. If I think Tracy was going to cue that up for me. I just have a couple of questions. One is, are you working at a company that's performing clinical research right now? I suspect a lot of you will answer yes. And maybe Paul, if you can look at the room by show of hands, how many people are working at a company that's performing some research right now?
Yeah, here in the room, it's just about 50%.
Okay, all right. And do we have polling results?
Yeah, so 84% online are saying yes, and obviously 16% no.
Okay, all right. So the next question is, are you involved, like you personally, Tendi, are you involved in CTA negotiation? Yes or no?
So here in the room, we've got 4 people raising their hands that they are yes involved in that.
Okay, great. Online?
And online, it's just about a 50-50 split. 56% say no, 44 yes.
Okay, quite a few. That's actually more than I even expected. Well, that's good to know. Chris, we can go to the next slide. So I'm glad to hear that, because we're going to spend a few minutes just going into the different aspects of clinical trial agreements. And I'm hoping you guys can see this a little bit better than I can read it. It's a little bit hard on the screen here, but I'll have to use black font next time, I think. But when I was preparing these slides, I thought, how can I visually depict what goes into a CTA without having, how many 6 times 5, 30 slides on all of the different terms and conditions that typically you'll find in a clinical trial agreement. So when I say CTA, that's clinical trial agreement. By the way, in your folders, we have an acronym list. So if you hear different acronyms barked out today, hopefully the acronym list in your folder, or if you're online, those materials were sent out to you. So if you are scratching your head on an acronym, chances are you'll find it on that sheet. So I'm just going to run through really quickly. These are some of the different, oh, thank you, Chris. Look at that. Appreciate that. Much easier for me to read now. These are some of the different terms and conditions, refs, warranties you'll see in an agreement. So parties, effective date, term and termination, IRB, Investigational Review Board, EC for Europe, Ethics Committee approval. There may be terms on FDA requirements if you're doing an investigational study, whether an IDE or IND, who's responsible for that, whether it's been checked off. If you're doing an investigator-initiated trial, you want to have a term in there that says the investigator is responsible for that, for example. Study product, communication with regulatory authorities, meaning what if FDA comes and knocks on your investigator's door? Do you get to find out about that? Are they obligated to tell you? So you want a term in there that says yes. Informed consent, Part 50, monitoring / clinical events committee. So if something goes wrong, patient gets hurt, who adjudicates that? How is it kept track of? What has to happen in terms of reporting? Record retention and access to records. You're going to want to have something in your CTA that says you have a right to access the data. And that can be sometimes a contentious point at some sites. They'll say, well, we own the data. you have a right to it, blah, blah, blah. You need to parse that out, figure out what's what. So I'll just continue to kind of run through some of these different terms, and then in the following slides, I'll talk about the most contentious ones. Confidentiality and confidential information. How is it treated? Do you want the terms of your CTA to be confidential? Privacy, pretty self-explanatory. Publication rights and use. Who has to do what? How long do you have to review data? IP. What if someone's created during the trial? Who owns it? Etc. Is the site obligated to help you with prosecuting patents, for example, doing certain things? Could be, critical. Adverse event notification kind of goes along with the monitoring just above it. Indemnification, insurance, subject injury, publicity, governing law, compliance laws. I know I'm rattling through a lot here because I want to talk about what I see as the most important ones. Payment, and FMV stands for fair market value. Good clinical practices are the investigators and the institution agreeing to follow good clinical practices. Exclusion and debarment, not having anyone on the study that's been excluded or debarred, pretty obvious. Study materials, who owns those? That goes back to use as well. Signature block seems kind of like a silly one, but do you need the sub-investigators on the signature block? So that could be very important. Notices, where do they go? Modification, what if you want to change something? How do you do it? Budget, obviously, maybe one of the most critical elements. How are you going to pay the sites? Other covenants and warranties, we could go on and on with other legal terms and conditions that typically go into these. You may also have in the lower right there a facility use agreement, so also known as an FUA. And some sites will say, okay, you're going to negotiate with the institution, the PIs, but you're also going to enter a facility use agreement for use of certain sites. So those are, you're drinking off the fire hose here with me this morning, but those are the terms that if you were tasked with negotiating a CTA tomorrow, a clinical trial agreement, or even a research agreement where you're providing a grant to an investigator to perform some research. These are the different things that I would encourage you to check through and make sure that these are all covered in your agreement. And that's a pretty fundamental point about having an agreement at all. If anytime you're remunerating a physician or an institution, you're going to want that outlined in writing so that you can meet the personal services and management contract safe harbor, or at least attempt to meet it. Let's go to the next slide here, Chris. Okay, that's great. Thank you for updating the fonts on these. So I next said, those are all the things that go into a contract, what we just covered. If I'm in your seat, I'm thinking, well, Mark, which ones do I really need to drill into to make sure I get right? You should get them all right, obviously, but you're going to want to make sure that these are all in line. And these are the ones that when you send your CTA over to an investigational site, that institution is most likely to redline these terms among all the ones that we just talked about. Again, they may redline all of them, but these are the ones that are probably the most impactful to the organization. So publication rights and use. What you don't want to have happen is you negotiate a CTA, your study's complete, and it turns out that you can't do what you want to do with the data. Maybe you don't own it appropriately. You can't publicize it the way you want to. Maybe the review time that you have when a manuscript comes out related to the published data is limited to 15 days or something. That would be atypical and unacceptable. Typically you're going to have 60 to 90 days to review a manuscript, for example, that one of your investigators may be submitting. And what investigator rights exist? Do they have the right to just go publish anything they want without your review, or do you get an opportunity to review what is published before it's published? So that's an important clause that I encourage you to take a close look at. Thank you. Another, the IP aspects. absent, Theo on our team, we're not IP lawyers. Theo has a background in IP and also FDA law, but the rest of us are not IP lawyers, so we're not going to be reviewing your CTAs for IP compliance. And you should think about that, making that point. So you as well should, unless you're an IP lawyer, you really shouldn't be reviewing the red lines that the site just made to the IP clause. You're going to want to have a professional that's an IP attorney look at those changes. But those are very commonly edited clauses. It could involve, again, disclosure of IP reports, results, ownership, also the prosecution aspects, like you may have terms in there that talk to what the site agrees to do in order for the company to get the IP submissions, filings made. So, some of the basics with IP, you'll see, like negotiating with the VA, for example, can be quite challenging because they have a template that they use for CTAs, and they'll just say, you need to use ours, and we're going to own up all the IP. I did have one occurrence where I was successful in getting the VA to concede some points. I'm not sure how that I did that. That was a long time ago. But generally, they are pretty reluctant to change it, especially the IP clauses in their CRADAs. So, in that case, whenever I'm negotiating one of these, even if I redline it, I know we have a lot of attorneys signed up today. If I see some pretty obvious stuff in the IP clauses, there's tons of red ink splashed all over, and it says we own everything. It doesn't take an IP lawyer to know that that's not going to work for the company. And then, you're best suited to get your IP counsel involved for any final changes there. Indemnification, very contentious. It's rare that if you send a CTA over that the other side doesn't try and edit that. The way we work with our CTAs and draft them, we try and make them agreeable to both sides because that speeds the trial along. When you're burning $2 million a month as a startup, for example, and even if you're not, if you're a big company, but still wasting time on forms, and negotiation back and forth, that's very costly. So you want to start with a form, just a practice point outside of indemnification here, that should be agreeable to both sides. So think of whether, are you asking for the moon on everything? If your indemnification clause says, hey, other side, you're totally indemnifying us and we're not doing anything for you, you just have to assume that's not going to fly. So best thing to do with indemnification is make it bilateral. Take the very similar indemnities should be made to the other side as to you. And as an attorney that's negotiated probably over 1,000 CTAs, and I'm not exaggerating, I'm always comfortable with indemnification, especially if both sides are giving each other the same allowances. There are some nuances, but generally speaking, indemnification is pretty easy to overcome if there's objections there. And by the way, pick up the phone if you are working with another side and they start redlining. You'll be surprised if you call them during the process and just say, hey, I saw I got your red lines. Just thought maybe we could jump on the phone and run through them together. And if you talk through them, chances are you are going to have a much better time than if you're just sending emails back and forth in red lines. That personal element can really help smooth things out, which again gets that contract ultimately signed faster so that site can get rolling in the trial. Subject injury, probably number one on here, I'd say next to budget in terms of editing. Ultimately what I think about with subject injury is and what that means, just to back up, if someone gets hurt during the trial, who's going to pay for it? Is the patient on their own? Is the PI investigator somehow assisting, monetarily? Is the sponsor, or, your company, are you basically saying, yeah, we're going to cover all subject injuries? It's pretty common for the sponsor to cover them as long as they're related to the device. So the language around subject injury is critical. What you don't want to have happen is make that unclear and have it open-ended. anything that happens to the subject after they're implanted with a device or take a drug, whatever it may be, then we're going to cover it. Well, what if they trip and fall on ice and has nothing to do with your product? That I've seen that clause actually abused before, where patients that were already sick before the trial came into the site and then got more sick, and my client was on the hook ultimately for additional costs. Those were for clauses obviously I didn't negotiate, but so be really careful around the subject injury clause. And last one I'll cover here is the budget. That's pretty self-explanatory when you're talking about money. Naturally the site's going to want to get as much as they can, and the sponsor's going to want to pay as little as possible. Let's go to the next slide. These are some honorable mentions that didn't make it to my top 5. Informed consent, usually a pretty easy one to address. And by the way, what I'm talking about here with a lot of these is you've sent your form, your CTA, to the site, and now you've gotten red lines back, and they may have redlined the informed consent clause, and you may go back and say, look, we already negotiated this informed consent with the agency where we can't change it. That usually shuts that down pretty quick, that conversation. That, the informed consent isn't really subject to editing very often. It can be, but can be, challenging. Record retention, access to records. Sometimes you'll have sites get run the axle about who owns what and who can access what, and rightfully so. They're trying to protect their client. But usually once you talk with the site, like, look, we're running an ID or IND trial here, and we're paying for everything, they pretty quickly appreciate why the company needs access to the records and how long they need to be retained and things like that. Confidentiality and confidential information, it will get edited along with the IP clauses. So that it's kind of like a little brother to the IP clause. Insurance will be, edited in terms of amounts and coverage. Publicity, you may be working with Cleveland Clinic, Mayo, Scripps, UCLA, whatever it may be, Penn State, or UPenn rather. They may say, hey, well, you can't use our name, or you can. So this is where you go back to your clinical medical staff. What sort of publicity are we expecting here? Or do we want to do a press release when we have our first in human? And so you want to think of some of those things ahead of time, because you might be asking the PI from Mayo or wherever it is to be part of a press release on your first in human. And if your publicity clause says that you can't talk about Mayo, then that's problematic. Mayo, by the way, has a sort of a interesting fast track process, which I won't get into here, but they're actually quite good to work with from my experience. I've worked with pretty much every teaching hospital in the country, and if you catch me offline, I can give you a rundown on all the different some of the more challenging ones. I'd probably put UPenn in that bucket. Actually, it's a bit more of a handful. UCLA as well. Exclusion, debarment. Occasionally you'll have people redline that clause, and then once they understand that what you're trying to say is we can't have people that have been excluded or debarred by the government in the trial, they quickly understand what that clause is. A lot of times when you're working with attorneys on the other side, they may not have a lot of experience with CTA, so you have to be really patient with them. A lot of the same issues come up over and over. And once you educate them, you just kind of move on. Try not to have an acrimonious exchange with them. Chances are you'll be talking to them again in the future. Compliance with the anti-kickback statute, False Claims Act, HIPAA, all that. Again, sometimes I'll see red lines in there, and I'm like, look, we're just trying to protect our client, protect you. And they'll pretty much concede those points. And then governing law gets edited a lot, not usually a real big concern. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears a bit. We're going to talk about an OIG advisory opinion. And this is around patient subsidies. So this is an interesting one. I'm just going to do a time check here. Okay, we have a break at 10:30. I may borrow a little bit from that break. if you guys are okay with that. So this is an OIG advisory opinion 2205. That means it is recently issued, 22 marking the year there. Our clinical trial patient care cost subsidies. This is the question. So I did a typical IRAC, what we'll call, and for the lawyers out there, you already know what that means. For the non-lawyers, it's issue, rule, analysis, conclusion. So this is how they teach you how to break down cases in law school. So I'm going to do that with this advisory opinion. So the issue is in the form of a question. And then what we'll do is apply, I'll call it the facts of the case. We'll then call the rules out. I'll provide the OIG's analysis and their conclusion. I'll give you the conclusion first. The OIG blessed this arrangement. And so if you are out there and you're doing a clinical trial and you're thinking, gee, it would be great if we could cover some of the costs associated with the trial for our subjects, then you're going to want to listen closely to this, because ultimately that's what the OIG allowed this requester to do. So the way that OIG advisory opinion process works, we don't know who submitted this. A lot of times us insiders will know who the company is. It gets out, gets around. In this case, let's just jump into it with the issue first. Our clinical trial patient care cost subsidies, which could induce Medicare beneficiaries to participate in the study and provide prospective payments to providers, unlawful and therefore subject to prosecution under anti-fraud laws. So calling out the anti-kickback statute there and the civil monetary penalties law, which I'll just call CMP law from now on. The answer is it depends. Let's review a recent advisory opinion that considers this question. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so these are the facts of the case. Tried to break them up and make them easy to digest. Just bear with me. This can be a bit dry, but for a lot of you out there, you're industry insiders anyway, so dry is what we all do, right? So device manufacturer company, we'll call them, submitted a request for an advisory opinion to receive feedback on an arrangement. By the way, again, if they get positive feedback, they're golden. You know, they might not meet a safe harbor, but the government basically says we won't prosecute you. Company's investigational device is available for clinical use in the US pursuant to an FDA-approved Category B investigational device exemption. Category B means that the government is reimbursing the product and services associated with the investigational study. It is a one-time use device that uses a patient's own cells for the treatment of ischemic systolic heart failure. Company plans to enroll up to 260 patient subjects, and that fact comes in later that the government likes that there's a cap. It's a randomized controlled trial with a blinded control group. There's a 3-to-2 ratio for enrollment, meaning 40% will get the control. So they will not get the device, and that fact comes in to play in a minute here. As I already talked about this, as Category B studied, Medicare pays for the device and the services associated with it. We can go to the next slide. So here's some more facts, kind of or a dense slide here. I'll try and roll through and pull out the highlights. So this is an important point. The company's saying we're going to cover the cost sharing amounts for Medicare beneficiaries. They're actually also going to do it for the commercial payers, but the federal anti-kickback statute and CMP law, you know, they apply to the Medicare beneficiaries, those anti-fraud laws. The company will not advertise this. They're not going to have a brochure that says, hey, free study. We're going to cover all your costs. Information on the subsidies was included in the informed consent documents. The cost sharing amounts that are going to be covered, about $1,300 a patient. As a result of these subsidies, there won't be any out-of-pocket costs for the beneficiaries. So it's great for the beneficiaries. Investigators and sites will also make money because they're going to be able to charge for their services and they're guaranteed to get paid. Let's go to the next slide. So if you're, playing at home, why are we even talking about this? Why is this a potential fraud? Well, because we're paying for these services that otherwise the patients enrolled in the study would have to cover. And so the government's concerned, well, this could impact the beneficiary, i.e. the patient's decision as to whether to enroll or not. And it could also impact the physicians and the institution because they're going to get paid money to do the work. So if the company's paying for all of it, and then the government ultimately is picking up the tab at the end on some of the costs, the government's saying these could be bribes to the patients and the physicians because there's a lot of costs that we're paying for that are not incurred here. Okay, because there's category B reimbursement. Why does the requester want this, the company? This is what they said in the advisory opinion: to reduce financial barriers to enrollment and to reduce attrition. So they're saying if it costs $1,300, a lot of people are going to say, I'm not signing up. And okay, I'm going to have a bunch of tests in the next 2 years. I'm not signing up because I can't afford them. So they're saying, the company's like, in light of that, this will help facilitate socioeconomic diversity among the study subjects. Only the rich people are going to be able to be in it and not the people that can't afford these things. Also preserves blinding of the subjects because the subject gets a bill for these things that are unrelated to the treatment arm, the investigational arm. They'll say, well, gee, I can tell that I'm in the non-treatment arm, which then unblinds the study, which creates problems with the integrity of it. So there's a lot of good reasons, and you'll see that the government is later compelled by these in their analysis. But these are the reasons the company put forth. The government agreed with them. Although the advisory opinion focused on Medicare beneficiaries, the government said, hey, we're gonna do the same for private insurers. If you have Aetna, Blue Cross, United Health, whatever it may be, we're gonna do the same. Government like that. For Medicare beneficiaries that supplemental insurance such as Medigap or something else, then the company said, we'll just pay anything that's not paid by these supplemental insurers. Let's go to the next slide. These are the laws. I will not cover in depth. I don't want to take all your break time away. But the anti-kickback statute basically says if you give something a value with its remuneration is the term used, and the intent behind it is to induce referrals or purchases of products or services that the government pays for, then you violate the anti-kickback statute. Let's make a simple example. Hey, doctor, if you buy my drug or device, I'll give you $100 just for free for just buying it. Well, that's a kickback. That's exactly what we just described. You're giving something of value to induce a purchase that the government's paying for in that case. Violators face big fines and exclusion. You have to be excluded if you are convicted. That's why you see so many settlements under the anti-kickback statute, because the alternative is getting thrown out of the industry, usually for 5 years, sometimes longer. And that applies to persons and people, individuals, employees, and companies. Civil monetary penalty law basically says that you can't bribe a patient in order to get them to select a provider. So a doctor can't go out and bribe patients to get them to be their patients. Let's go to the next slide. So here's the analysis. This is where, and hang in there with me. Hopefully this is all making sense. It's complex, dense stuff, but it could be very important to you if you're conducting a trial and you want to subsidize subject enrollment costs. So the government starts out in their opinions. You can go online and read this opinion. And they say, hey, this doesn't meet a safe harbor. So now we'll look at whether it's going to drive over utilization, distort competition, distort physician thinking, decision-making, distort patient decision-making, etc. So the government said the subsidies outlined in the proposed arrangement are a reasonable way to promote socioeconomic diverse study subject enrollment and retention. So that's a plus. Okay, second, the company would, they like that the company's going to offer the same subsidies to subjects with Medicare or commercial insurance. We talked about that earlier. The payments made to the site and the institution, not the beneficiary, not the healthcare professional directly either. We could add that. And the proposed arrangement has a low risk of overutilization and inappropriate billing. They give several reasons for that. Because the company won't advertise it, because there's informed consent with the patients, they know what they're getting into. There's IRB oversight and monitoring, and the enrollment is capped at 260. A lot of times in these types of advisory opinions, the government likes these programs to be limited, something to think about anytime you're worried about violating potentially the AKS. What's the scope of your potential program? And then the last thing, number 5, that it's not a seating arrangement. So seating arrangement means I'm a device maker, a drug maker, I'm going to give free stuff out in order to get people hooked. And then later the government will come in and start paying for it. This is a one-time use device. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the conclusion, the OIG says it presents minimal risk, fraud, abuse, and in its discretion, it's not going to impose sanctions. So hopefully that's helpful. There are some more facts in the advisory opinion, but we've had several clients that have looked at subsidizing some arrangements. It's been kind of tough to analyze because we didn't know what the government thought of that, and now we have this nice advisory opinion. Let's go to the next slide, Chris, and I'm going to try and run through the last of these slides so we can get over to a break and then hear from Amanda. So again, while developing this presentation, I tried to say what are the most important things I want to convey to the audience? What are the most risky things associated with clinical research? Well, bribing people, that's one of the keys. That's why we just hit this advisory opinion, and now I want to talk more about the avoidance of violating the anti-fraud laws. Paying people at fair market value, paying institutions to do the research is critical. You'll want to attempt to meet the personal services and management contract safe harbor. I say attempt because it's going to be difficult, because one of the elements of that safe harbor says that you can't pay based on the value or volume of referrals or purchases. And if you're going to pay more for more enrollees, then I'm not sure that safe harbor element's met. So you'll want to attempt to meet it nevertheless. Obviously, paying for research is very common, and it's not something the government is interested in prosecuting unless it's bogus research, for example, or it's overpaid, or it doesn't meet other elements of the safe harbor. So pay at fair market value. You can't pay for research because you like a customer. Hey, that's a KOL. Let's sugar them up with a bunch of payments for some research we really don't need. That's inappropriate. So your grant making function, your clinical research function should be divorced from your sales and marketing people and anybody else with a commercial hat on. We audit companies all the time. Sometimes we go into companies and do a healthcare compliance audit, and the clinical VP reports to somebody that's ultimately overseeing commercial. I don't like that. I don't care what you call them, GM, head, whatever. If their job ultimately is to sell product and they're in charge of clinical research, I'm not a fan of that arrangement. I'm going to call that out in my audit. So get the sales and marketing function away from research. There are times that they can help make introductions or go and check in on a site. Maybe there's some information that needs to be, something basic provided to them, but they should not be, involved in decision making. Absolutely, when it comes to deciding who's going to research what or make payments, you got to get them out of that equation. Some other tips, go through your budget meticulously. What is every line item on there? A lot of times you see some things buried in there. I'll look at a budget and I'll see, a bonus for getting more subjects. And we're going to talk about that on the next slide. That's not something that should be in there. Something that's often overlooked, how are you basing your budget? What are you using? Medicare rates as a starting point, or have you got Grant Pro, which is like data you can purchase and have access to? How are you basing your payment rates? There should be some sort of benchmark that you're gauging off of. Maybe you can go higher, but how high are you going to go? you might be working with UPenn and they'll say, I don't know exactly what their overhead is today, but I want to say one year I was working with them and it was like 40%, meaning we're charging overhead. You'll see that now at these big teaching hospitals where they know that you want their name on the masthead of the publication that you're going to have out. And so they're going to charge for overhead, which I've debated that with attorneys at different hospitals, and we say, you want 40%, we're not going to do that, because I think that this could be a kickback and we're going to have problems and you're going to have problems. It's sort of a ripe issue, frankly, that hasn't really been challenged by the government. But be careful with those overhead payments. I kind of was teasing one attorney once, I remember, and I said, what do you mean overhead? Are we paying for to keep your lights on? Like, just, we're paying for research. I'm not responsible for all the services to keep the hospital open. Again, carefully draft your budget, look it over. If you have triggers for payment, you're paying in tranches. Sometimes you'll see that more with like investigative initiative trials. Then, make sure the milestones are met before you release another tranche. With a typical CTA, if you're doing an ID or IND, you're not going to have a tranche arrangement. It's going to be all itemized. Let's go to the next slide. Patient enrollment incentives, bonuses, bounties, spiffs. What do you think of these? I didn't want to out anyone, but this would have been a good question to have to poll the audience. How many of you, because we have a lot of people involved in research, are paying bonuses, or they're called bounties or spiffs? Whenever clients call me and ask me, can we pay more money? Can I send somebody on a trip that works at the investigator site when they get, up to 10 people, or can I give them just cash and Amazon card or whatever? My answer is always no, don't do that. That's not, it's something that is out of vogue. I know, and I always hear my someone that worked at another company did this, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, first of all, it's hearsay. Second of all, name the big company out there, chances are they've been in trouble. So that's not compelling to me. To be clear, the AMA says, quote, offering or accepting payment for referring patients to research studies is finder's fees is unethical. Some states embody the AMA rules into their laws, like Ohio. So just, be mindful of that. And then guess what? Do you think hospitals follow the AMA rules? Yeah, most of them will embody their rules as well. So don't pay bonuses. What can you do? Pay more to get some more people working on the enrollment activities and pay them fair market value at arm's length. That's okay. All right, I'm going to wrap up here pretty quick. Let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to just really summarize this. You all have the slides. FDAA requires that you report 801 of the FDAA's Food and Drug Administration Amendments Act 2007. You have to report clinical trial results. And the FDA is getting pushed by consumer protection groups to make sure that sponsors are indeed publishing their research, and they're starting to send letters out. So Ocugen got a notice of noncompliance. A lot of other companies have gotten these as well. I'll just read here a little bit so you can appreciate the law a little more. A responsible party for an applicable clinical trial is required to submit to the clinicaltrials.gov database certain results and information for the clinical trial. This must be generally submitted no later than 1 year after the primary completion date. Okay. So you got to get this stuff in. Let's go to the next slide. And this is a pretty contemporary notice of noncompliance. This is just last month. So, this company is facing fines and bad press now. So they've already got the bad press part. Now they're facing fines. They were supposed to post by May 15. I'm not sure if they have yet or not. But yeah, there's 40 other pre-notices of noncompliance that were sent out, and even by the FDA, and some were even sent to the principal investigators trial. So, do you want your PI mad at you? Hey, now I'm getting letters because you guys haven't done your job. So just be mindful of that. And I think that's it for me. I do have one more question maybe before we cut off. Let's go to the next slide, Chris. To poll the audience, after what we talked about with that advisory opinion, is covering certain subject costs something your organization may consider? I should have probably asked that before and after, but maybe Paul, what do you see in the audience there? And if the folks at home online could also respond, that'd be great. So yes or no, is covering certain subject costs something your organization may consider?
So in the audience, there's a couple of hands up. They're kind of back and forth, kind of a maybe. So, certainly something to think about, but not a strong agreement that, yes, that's something they're going to do.
Yeah, you have to go find that money somewhere, right?
And there's a question. I'm going to walk the microphone to you.
Okay, great.
And just real quick, online, let's see, 84% say yes online. So a much different response online than in the room.
Yeah, when we're doing a study on a device and we're providing the device free of charge because it's a non-commercial device, number one. And then number two, we're reimbursing the facility for the lab tests that are dictated in the protocol, even if they're standard of care, because we're dictating at certain specific time points, we're reimbursing for those lab. So with that, is that just kind of okay?
Do you have any, is the product being or service being reimbursed by the government? Like, I think you said it was a device. Do you have category B or A reimbursement?
It will need to be applied for CMS approval, yes.
Okay. So, if you didn't have any reimbursement, then arguably the law doesn't apply, right? Because you wouldn't be asking the government to pay for anything. There could be an argument for pull through for other products and services you offer, but generally, it's not uncommon, as you know, for companies to pay for everything. And you have a lot more discretion then, but you should still follow all the rules we just talked about and good clinical practices, obviously. If you do have category B or A just means the device isn't paid for, but the services are, then you want to basically walk through that analysis that we just went through. That advisory opinion will be very important for you to determine whether or not you can cover. I didn't hear you say any subject costs. You were going to give the device away for free, and then you were going to pay for some diagnostics.
Right. We're not providing any payments to the subjects. In fact, we're applying for CMS approval so that they will go, Medicare will pay for the standard procedure because it's just our device that's used in a regular procedure. So all we're providing is the device. So the patients are not getting charged for the device itself. We're not paying for anything else that happens in the procedure. And then lab tests pre and post procedure that are required by the protocol at certain time points.
Yeah. So it'll become a fact-intensive analysis as to whether or not what sort of reimbursement you get. If you apply for category A, for example, and not B, I think that would help the facts. What you wouldn't want to do is apply for category B, which then says, hey, CMS, pay for this device that we're giving away for free, because then the customer would be the beneficiary of that. And then as far as the diagnostic test goes, I feel like there's probably, I think the prospects are good for that as well, but it comes down to a fact-intensive analysis. And I guess that's just a bit of a disclaimer to give today that I didn't give at the beginning of the program. We're happy to give some feedback to you, but if you're seeking legal advice, so talk to your lawyer or come to us and we can talk about how we can provide legal advice to you. But not trying to escape the question there, but just want to give that disclaimer. Any other questions? All right, good, because
we got another question really quick, and then I'm going to go back to one more question, then we'll do a 10-minute break.
Okay, good. I was getting question envy there because you guys got so many.
Just a quick one. The study product itself, you didn't mention anything about setting up a retrieval program to make sure that you got any leftover parts, or if a device fails, how you get it back, setting up a retrieval kit, and it, for example, so that you're not shipping hazardous materials around. Are there strings that you can attach to your study product so they don't go floating off to your competition?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's that one category that was under product that was on that chart. Unfortunately, since I only have 30 minutes, I can't really get into all that detail, but you raise an excellent point that you'll want to have some terms and conditions around the study product, what it can be used for, what it can't be used for, what happens to it if they're not used up. You're going to want to get them returned. They can't resell them. Your T's and C's will also want to get into, that there's no warranties with it. If there's a defective product, you're merely going to replace it. You're going to want to have a bunch of clauses like that in the contract. So that's a very good point. And you kind of have all of that negotiated in there. And in fact, you should probably have a clause in there about what you just described. And that would be under the confidentiality aspect too, where your competitors cannot get a hold of these devices. So all really good points.
All right, we're going to take one more question, then we'll break.
In the CTA, you were talking about having the signature block, and you wanted the PI and the sub-I sign the signature block in the CTA. What if, and this is what I have had done in tons of other studies, the PI actually signs the main CTA, but then you have investigator agreements that all the sub-Is have to sign. Is that still okay?
I like that. Yeah, and a lot of times you'll even just have in that block like a read and understood, because you want to think it through with the PI. Are you going to include the sub PI in throughout the entire agreement? It just gets really complicated to have so many parties. So typically what you'll do is either have the sub PI sign off on something like you just described, or you can even have a read and understood at the end, but they may not be, are on the hook for everything within, although I'd argue they would be. If it were ever, if that were ever litigated, I think that the sub PI would have a hard time saying that the agreement didn't apply to them. But the specific elements within the CTA they generally describe the PI, and then they will not also, get to the sub PI level.
Okay, and then just one quick other one. When you were talking about incentives and bonuses, what I'm finding from a lot of clinical sites now is they're requiring payment for screen failures. So does that fall under a bonus or something like that?
I don't think so. I mean, if they're screening people and they're just not candidates for the trial, I think it's okay to pay them for that time.
Okay.
I don't see an issue with that. I mean, you'd want to make sure that they're being truthful and honest, and that they're not just pulling people in that are clearly unqualified for the trial just to try and drive revenue. But I don't, most of these institutions that perform investigation don't have time for that kind of nonsense. So yeah, no, I like what you described, though. I think that would make sense.
So we do have one more question online. So I think these questions are an important part of the program. So we're going to cover this last question. It reads, we cover all costs for our clinical trials and include patient stipend for their time and travel, but the device is available commercially and covered by insurance and Medicare. Do we have to comply with OIG 522 opinion?
It's going to be different. That sounds like an interesting one. Did you say the device is already approved?
Correct. It's available commercially. So I'm assuming, yes, approved, cleared.
Okay. So, yeah, one of my questions would be like, is it being reimbursed? And, if they're paying for everything, that shouldn't be. So that'd be a red flag. If everything's free to the patient and the site's getting paid, and then the site's ultimately billing back to Medicare, Medicaid, or other federal payers, that would concern me. So, I mean, it's a pretty fact-intensive question, so I'm not sure I can provide an answer to it right now, but those are some of my thoughts off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you. That's the questions for now. Let's take a 10-minute break. We'll meet back just a little bit before 11 and resume. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.